Our second lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slaves said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No. For in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Before Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans nearly 11 years ago this summer, Jean Gibson ran the benefits department for all the city workers. She was a homeowner, and most months, one of her paychecks covered all her bills. She drove a nice car and wore expensive clothes to work. When the storm hit, she was at home with her husband and their two grandchildren, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. Within days, the 4 of them had been evacuated to Houston, where they stayed in a hotel. Then their credit card hit its limit. Jean tried to withdraw money from an ATM, but she discovered that her bank in New Orleans was closed and she had no way to access her money. The hotel kicked them out, and there they were, stuck in Texas with no money, no place to stay, and no way to get back home. So Jean did something she'd never imagined herself doing. She sat on a curb near a Kmart and begged from every car that went into or out of the parking lot. She said things like, "If you just give me some Pampers, just some Pampers and some food for the children, you don't have to give me anything, just some food for the children." Someone finally asked her whether she was from New Orleans, and when she said yes, he bought her some diapers and some macaroni. Of course, she had nowhere to cook the pasta, but the children were so hungry they just ate it dry. A reporter asked Jean later whether when her life changed so abruptly she felt like a different person. "No," she said, "that's not what happens. What happens is you get very practical. How do you solve the next problem?" The only solution she could think of was to beg, something she'd never done before. "I even banged on people's car windows," she admitted, and asked them, "Can you please help me and my babies? Because of the way I looked, they must have thought I was a crackhead or something, using those babies." And let me tell you, the reason I thought that was because I used to think that about people who did what I was doing. At the beginning of the book of Job, we meet Job in the prime of his life. He has what most people aspire to: wealth, status, good health, and a large and loving family. He also has a deep faith in God, such a deep faith, in fact, that there's a debate going on in heaven about Job between God and a character called the Satan. This Satan suggests to God that Job's faith is not so deep, that in fact his faith is directly tied to his wealth, status, good health, and large and loving family. God thinks otherwise and agrees to put Job to the test, and Job loses everything. In what must have seemed like an instant, his life is turned upside down. And yet he does not become a different person. He persists in his faith. This is what most of us probably think of when we hear that phrase, the patience of Job. the fact that Job maintains his steadfast faith in God in the face of unimaginable suffering. But this book of the Bible is 42 chapters long, filled with dense Hebrew poetry, which suggests that Job's patience is not only more extensive, but also a lot more complex than simply unwavering faith in the midst of suffering. The 25 chapters that make up the middle of the book of Job are a conversation between Job and 3 of his friends who visit him in his suffering and who are trying to do what Jean described as be practical, figure out the next thing. Job's friends are doing what most of us do when we are faced with tragedy. They're trying to come up with a logical explanation. Who among us is not tempted by that desire to explain why bad things happen? None of us can look at the evil in the world without trying to rationalize it. The atrocities being visited by the Syrian government on its own citizens, the fact that in our own nation, 17 million children go to bed hungry every night, the indiscriminate reach of cancer and other awful diseases which strike young and old, rich and poor, smokers and non-smokers, and of course, just last week, another horrific mass shooting. Like Job's friends, we work hard to come up with plausible explanations for such things. We point to corruption, the welfare state, carcinogens in our environment, easy access to guns, homegrown terrorism. But even as these explanations leave our lips, we know that there are things that simply defy our attempts to make sense of them. There are things we will never understand, things we cannot explain, things we just don't know. The problem is that I don't know might just be the 3 hardest words in the English language for us to say. Child psychologists recently gathered a dozen 6-year-olds and told them a simple story of a family that spent the day at the beach. Then they asked the kids questions about this story. Did the family drink lemonade at lunch? The story didn't say, but all the kids said, oh yes, they did. Did they listen to music in the car on their way to the beach? Again, the story was silent on this subject, but the children all said yes or no. It seems the children would do almost anything to avoid saying, I don't know. Then the psychologist shifted the questions to other topics. Is a sweater angrier than a tree? Is red heavier than yellow? Yes, said one girl. No, said a boy. One boy gave this elaborate answer about red being a heavier color than yellow. From a young age, it seems we will do anything to avoid saying simply, I don't know. In the face of Job's suffering, his friends cannot find a way to say, I don't know why this happened to you. They use all of their intellect and experience to come up with an explanation. Never mind that Job makes it very clear that every one of their attempts falls way short. Eventually, for Job, the only thing that makes sense is to demand an explanation from the only one who could actually give it. God. In the midst of his suffering, Job refuses to stay silent. He patiently maintains his faith in God, but the patience of Job is a patience that refuses to let God off the hook, a patience that holds God accountable, a patience that demands a response from God. Last Sunday night, Connecticut Representative Jim Hines decided that he could no longer go along with the usual response to mass shootings by Congress, which is to observe a moment of silence in honor of the victims. We should be shouting the names of the people who are killed in preventable violence, he said, not standing there in some mock and tepid ritual of sanctity. When asked what his initial response was when he heard about Orlando, he said, "My first reaction was what my first reaction has been just about every week since Newtown, which is just horror, and a sense of, it happened last week, it happened the week before, it'll happen next week, until we finally do something." In the parable we heard of the weeds and the wheat, Jesus addresses our impatience with the problem of evil in the world. Jesus knows how badly we want to separate out the good from the bad. But in this parable, the weeds Jesus refers to are very tricky. The word he uses for weeds describes a plant that looks just like wheat until the wheat bears grain. So by the time you know for sure which is the weeds and which is the wheat, you are likely to end up doing more damage than good by trying to get rid of the weeds. Until the harvest, it is better to be patient and leave them both alone. Tom Long says this parable is the best biblical explanation he can find for the problem of evil in our world. Here, Jesus acknowledges evil's reality and that it comes from some force that is not God. There is some enemy who comes in by night and sows the weed right in the midst of the good wheat. Jesus also suggests here that evil is such an intricate part of our world, so entwined with all that is good, that to try to rationalize it away or separate it completely from goodness, we risk damaging the good as well. And so, in the face of tragedy and sorrow that we do not understand, Jesus counsels patience. What an unsatisfying answer. But it reminds us, especially this week as we struggle with senseless loss, that God's ways are not ours to understand or explain or rationalize. Sometimes we have to accept there are things in life we must wait to understand, or even, as Job eventually discovers when God does answer him, things in this life we will never fully understand. This does not mean that I disagree with Representative Hines' call to action. I share that frustration, and I expect Jesus does too. After all, I cannot find anywhere in the Gospels where Jesus suggests that as we wait to better understand the nature of God's ways and God's kingdom, we, his followers, should simply throw up our hands and sit back, doing nothing to diminish the suffering we see all around us. On the contrary, Jesus himself is constantly on the move, constantly tending to people's needs, and constantly sending his followers out to do the same, which suggests that the patience Jesus counsels is much more active than passive. It is active and it is communal. We do it together. As we practice the patience of Job, a patience that brings to God all of our confusion and anger and despair and longing for hope and healing and peace, Jesus reminds us that we are called to come together with and for one another while we wait. Father Gregory Boyle tells the story of a young man named Pedro, a kid caught in gang life on the streets of LA. Pedro was so filled with rage and resentment, he covered it up with heavy drinking and an addiction to crack cocaine. Whenever Boyle saw Pedro on the streets, he would offer to take him to rehab, and Pedro would always decline. Until one day he changed his answer and finally began the long, hard journey of returning to himself. 30 days into Pedro's rehab, his younger brother, caught up in similar demons, did the unthinkable. He took his own life. When Father Boyle called Pedro with the news, Pedro was devastated. Boyle arrived at the rehab center to take Pedro to the funeral, and before he could even figure out what to say, Pedro began to tell Boyle about a dream he'd had the night before. In this dream, Pedro and Father Boyle are in a large empty room alone. There are no lights, no windows. It is complete and total darkness. But despite the darkness, Pedro knows that Father Boyle is there with him, even though no words are spoken. Suddenly, in the dark silence, Boyle retrieves a flashlight from his pocket and turns it on. Slowly, deliberately, he shines the flashlight around the room until its narrow beam illuminates a light switch on the wall. No words are spoken, no explanation offered, no promise of a better tomorrow, just a beam of light revealing a switch on the wall. In the dream, Pedro stands up, realizing he is the one who has to turn on the light. Slowly, with some trepidation, he makes his way to the switch, takes a deep breath, and flips it on. The room is flooded with light. At this point in the retelling of his dream, Pedro is sobbing. With a voice of astonishing discovery, he said, "And the light is better than the darkness," as if he did not know this before. Then he said, "I guess my brother just never found the switch." Boyle writes, "Possessing flashlights and occasionally knowing where to aim them has to be enough for us. None of us can save anybody, but we all find ourselves in this dark, windowless room, fumbling for grace and flashlights. You aim the light this time, and I'll do it the next." As we patiently wait through what we do not understand, may we actively claim God's love and grace for all people. For when we do this, even while we wait for God to be revealed to us, we reveal God. God's love, God's grace, God's peace to one another. Amen.